Future trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Ghostly Grain Feed, brought to you by EverAct. This is your weekly news feed for all things grain and all things feed. Each week, we bring you updates on the markets with unique perspectives from an amazing team of spooky analysts with the intention of helping dairy and livestock producers manage your risk. I'm your host, Jim Matthews, reporting from a bone-chilling Chicago on a cool and rainy Halloween morning. Joining me today, as always, from creepy Kansas, Director of Feed Foundations, Jake the Jack-o'-lantern Kingsley, and returning to the grain feed from the Madhouse in Madison, President of EverAg Insights, Phil the Phantom Plourd. Team, how are we today?
Feeling pretty spooky.
You're looking pretty spooky. Phil, how are you?
I'm just wondering if it's a trick or a treat.
I think with Jake, we get a little bit of both. You've been giving the viewers a sneak preview, let's say starting last week. An unfortunate group of our clients have had to see some of what's happening in the background. There's a theme in the Kingsley household. What's happening back there?
Just hanging out with my friends for Halloween.
You look fantastic, and so do your friends. We're very glad to have them with us for the grain feed. Phil, Halloween, how are we feeling?
You know, we're at that stage where we don't have children in the house, and so for the 10th year in a row, I'm going as a dairy market analyst for Halloween. It's my costume of the day.
It's eerily similar to a dairy analyst. You've done an amazing job.
Pull it off. All right, yeah.
Well done.
I did my hair a little differently today, but yes.
Very nice. We have a lot to run through on this very special Halloween episode. But first, Lexi, if you would please kindly timestamp the broadcast. It's Thursday morning, Halloween. It's a little after 11 a.m. Chicago time, recording just a touch later than normal. But let's take a quick look at the markets as we wrap up the month of October. We have December corn just down a tick this morning. Corn has been somewhat range-bound here over the last few sessions now. We're holding just above 410. We're at about 411 and a quarter as we record this morning on that December corn market. We have Novi beans, which will be going off the board now here in a couple weeks. Novi beans is up 3 cents. It's just under 980 today, and we'll be rolling over to Jan beans soon, also up about 2.5 as we roll into the month of November tomorrow. We have December meal, that not as stubborn little byproduct, as we record, has been able to push down through $300 per ton. So we had a glimpse of this back in August. We are seeing a 2-handle in front of December meal, trading $299.90 as we record. So just a tick right under 300, that very formidable support and psychological support at $300 per ton. We've managed to break it as we record the grain feed this morning. There's a lot happening in the markets, especially in the next week or so, given that we have an election coming up. We're wrapping up, the end of the month today. Harvest running like crazy in the grain markets, wrapping up here in the next week or two. There's a lot going on, but especially in the dairy market. So we brought in Phil Plourd to help us digest some of the dairy markets this morning. Phil, what's going on out there?
Actually, things aren't that exciting, Jim. Sorry for the letdown.
Just trying to be a hype man over here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. But I think that, early October was pretty noisy, where we had butter kind of in free fall, and we saw the cheese market in a pretty massive retreat from its highs. And now we're in that, we're somewhere looking at Thanksgiving a few weeks in the distance and saying, where do all the wholesale pipelines line up for that? What's the promotional activity going to be? And, we're going to pull through a lot of consumption, during that time of the year we usually do. In the meantime, I think the big questions are still the big questions. Question number one, can we export cheese? How much, when, and is it going to be enough? The European cheese price has been coming down. Our competitiveness was very obvious 3 weeks ago, less obvious today. Where are we going to be in 6 weeks if European cheese markets kind of ratchet down to $1.90? Where can the U.S. be? I'm tired of talking about it in the sense maybe clients are tired of hearing about it. We just are looking at mozzarella in Europe versus CME barrels and the CSC futures and just saying, where are we? Because I think it's still the biggest question dictating the pace in the cheese universe. So that's a big question. I think butter, as far as from a wholesale perspective, butter is done, right? For Thanksgiving anyway, butter is done. We're starting to see some specials. One of the big changes this week, kind of a hot $2.49 deal. There's a few little, you got to buy this and that to make it all happen. But we're expecting to see some pretty aggressive deals the next few weeks on butter. And do we drive enough consumption that backfill on the other side of Thanksgiving is noisy? Maybe, maybe not. And then the milk production question, does more money make more milk? And we've flip-flopped on this a few times, just trying to weigh the obvious financial opportunity that seems to be on the table today for dairy producers against the often talked about dairy animal shortages, base excess programs, other limitations. And so, those are the export question and, more money make milk question. I think those are the big driving forces as we end 2024 and start 2025. And it's hard to know for sure.
You mentioned butter in terms of being priced in for supply and demand purposes into Thanksgiving, and then you have that backfill potential activity following that. Do you have the same type of run-up heading into Christmas and New Year's, or is Thanksgiving really the big one for Q4?
Thanksgiving's the really big one. It's a multiple of activity. We see the week ahead of Thanksgiving is by far the biggest week of the year. I think Easter is number 2, and then maybe Christmas is number 3. So, Christmas is not unimportant, but from a timing perspective, especially this year with giving on November 28th, it's as short a run as possible into Christmas as you can get on the calendar, I'm pretty sure, from Thanksgiving to Christmas. So there's not a lot of time to rejigger things here and there. We have historically seen some times where, the retailers got really cleaned out for Thanksgiving to a surprising degree and kind of had to scramble to, hustle for a week to get things reloaded for Christmas. We've seen that historically. But Thanksgiving is the day. And then, I don't know, does the consumer presented with an opportunity to buy $2.49 butter? Do they buy, 6 and that goes into the Christmas cookies too? It's not all about the mashed potatoes, so to speak. I think even that week before Thanksgiving can propel. The consumption there could be for the weeks beyond too when we start making cookies and the butter consumption goes up there also.
Okay, gotcha. And then, of course, not only the big day of the month of November, we also have the election in November, and that's just around the corner. That's next week on Tuesday. So, Phil, we're not going to pin you on who's going to win, but we might ask you, what are some of the potential price swings you might see in the dairy markets as we experience and then digest the election and its results between, early November through whomever is inaugurated come January?
Yeah, I was thinking about that this morning, in the context of this show. We talk about fearless predictions, and I was like, I don't know if there's a fearless prediction, and I don't want to make one, or are there fearful predictions? Look, I think that what's unique about this is we've seen the movie kind of before, right? President Trump was President Trump, and if we have a version 2, we kind of know he's got an aggressive posture on some of these tariff issues and trade issues. But the reality is that the Biden administration really didn't undo much, if anything. The Biden administration's trade policy hasn't wavered radically from where the Trump administration was. Now, Mr. Trump being Mr. Trump, if he comes back to town, so to speak, there'll be some table pounding and some bombast. And I would guess that, we'll be sharpening the edge of our talks about China especially, and probably Mexico as well. And so that has some risks or opportunities or some noise, volatility potential associated with it. As far as Ms. Harris, I've not really seen any dramatic analysis or expectations of how her trade policy would differ radically from that of Donald Trump. Trade is a big issue. I think, we know where Mr. Trump stands, and I think that he goes back to pounding the table again. And I think anything's possible, right? Oh, yeah, we have the USMCA. He negotiated that deal, but I think they're going to say, look, that was 6-7 years ago. Things have changed. These are our new demands, right? And as far as China goes, I think that there's any number of things can be on the table. And maybe trade's the wrong place to look. Maybe the right place to look is around energy policy and green stuff, climate policy. And I would guess that with a Trump presidency, we would see a slowing down or a rolling back of some of the more stringent regulations, rules, agendas around environmental things, drilling for energy, various, EV mandates, right? All those sorts of things I think probably get pushed aside. In a Harris presidency, I think they are no worse than same speed. And if you somehow have full Democratic control of the House, Senate, and the presidency, maybe even an acceleration of some of those policies. And so maybe that's where the opportunities or volatility comes from, might be on the domestic side, right? We're all looking at trade. I don't know how you predict the outcomes of those trade things, but I think that the approach is probably predictable. I think the bigger wild card might be on the green climate side of things domestically. Here's the understatement of the day, Jim. There is some weirdness around this election. You have Kennedy, who has come out and endorsed President Trump, and he's got some anti-big food streak to him. I mean, he's talking about, big food and additives, and which are things that you would expect to hear from the other side. I guess he's crossing the aisle. If Kennedy has a prominent role in the Trump administration, do we see some things that you would never expect to see under a quote-unquote classic Republican? I mean, there's a lot of wild cards in this one. We're not into that. A week from today, on Thursday of next week, will we know for sure what's actually happened?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, it could be a bit. And we remember back to the 2000 election with Bush versus Gore. That took several weeks to ultimately determine the final results of that election. So, I mean, we can easily foresee a potential scenario this time around. And I think, Phil, there's something that you noted there, we've been talking to clients about from the feed side as well, is I think probably most volatility would come from a clean sweep, right? If you had the Democrats take over both chambers of Congress and the White House, and or the Republicans doing that and having a sweep of their own, I think that's where potentially markets try and really react, because then whoever becomes the president and has that party at their side is perhaps, I don't want to say unchecked, but let's say less checked than otherwise. You noted too, Phil, have things changed all that much since Trump's first term? I mean, we had the initial run up in tariffs from the feed side, right? From corn, beans, meal. We saw exports take a massive hit in 2018, 2019. Because that's when we really ignited that trade battle with China and some of the retaliations there. And then we had phase one of the trade deal that they ultimately negotiated kick in. We saw a lot of ag products leave the country come 2020, 2021. You saw that big ramp up in exports from corn, beans, meal, etc. And I think your energy comments are very important as well, because we've been having that same conversation. We look very closely at the meal markets being on the feed side, and how bean oil and the crush pace of soybeans affects the production and supply of having meal on hand here in the United States. And if there is a clean sweep from the Republicans, perhaps there is a complete revamp of the way that green initiatives are approached, and maybe there's less incentives for blending some of our vegetable oils and or just outright creating renewable diesel or blending into biodiesel. I think that's been a really big driver of a lot of the plants we've seen come online. And the reason we've seen meal production continue to hit new records month on month. So maybe that's also a good transition then to turn her over to Jake Kingsley and family or friends, or whatever's happening in the Kingsley household down in the crypt of the Kingsley dungeon. But Jake, there's a lot happening in the feed markets, and I do overhype what's happening in the markets every week, so thank you to Phil for correcting me there. Maybe there hasn't been a lot happening in feed. Meal's been on a pretty steady decline, hovering right at $300. Again, we finally broke it here today. Corn has been fairly range bound, so maybe not a ton actually going on. But Jake, last day of the month here, harvest is going to be wrapping up. Talking to Phil about the election coming up. What do you see going on in the grain and feed markets as we push into the month of November tomorrow?
Yeah, I think talking about that slide in soybean meal futures has probably been the biggest move week on week. Talked about harvest wrapping up on Monday evening. We got the data showing that both corn and soybeans had cleared the 80% harvested mark. As a response to that, we've seen a lot of basis numbers either stagnate or even start to firm up a little bit. I would say that's definitely true for corn and soybean meal in most regions. Canola seems to be the outlier there. I think, again, with Canadian logistics getting sorted out, a healthy crop there and stuff starting to try to find a home. And I think veg oil values have been healthy enough that some canola oil sales have been made, and those folks are comfortable then turning loose of some meal. So that basis number has drifted lower, but corn and soybean meal have kind of flattened out, or like I said, perked back up here as harvest wraps up. The bin doors get closed for the winter months here, and basis is going to have to do some of the work to pop some of that grain back out into the supply chain. Now, we're not worried about a big run up in any of those numbers because at the end of the day, the balance sheets are healthy. We've got very robust ending stocks in both categories, and the grain is going to have to go somewhere. But for now, ethanol margins are good, so those folks are paying a little bit of a premium to keep grain moving. Export sales have been very steady, trying to decide if that's some bargain buying down here towards the lows or if that's some preparatory buying ahead of the election. As we talked, it's hard to know how the trade landscape, the global trade landscape, could change come next week. Maybe it's a little bit of both. It's easy to say, you know what, this is a good deal. We've also got a South American weather market to contend with. Those guys are starting to catch some decent rains and moving right along in their planting progress. So the concern, at least in the immediate market, has been relieved from South American weather, but we got a long ways to go there. I think the opportunity right now is to step in and get some more pricing done while cash prices are under some pressure. Set yourself up to play some offense if we get into a little bit of a spooky weather season there for South America. We catch a rally and you can try to cheapen up some feed on the way back down or something of that sort. So yeah, starting to check a few things off the list here. And I think by the end of next week, we'll be looking at truly just South American weather and a little bit of hopefully a quieter season moving into the end of the year there.
Yeah, and I think you made a great point, Jake, about let's take advantage of what the market has given us here, right, to an extent. Is the corn market 20 cents, 25 cents off the August lows? Yes, it is. Those August lows were 4-year lows, and as you noted, we saw a lot of export activity start to pick up, right, in terms of China, Mexico, right? Some of the customers that Phil brought up earlier, they stepped in a big way to start buying U.S. commodities. Now, were we at 4-year lows on a few of these products? Yes. Is this also, going back to the election, a potential administration hedge, right, depending on who might take office and or control Congress come January? Perhaps. But it was nice to see, at least from the U.S. farmers' perspective, some of these exports start to pick up. And as we saw in today's export sales report, another very strong week of corn sales and bean sales coming out of the U.S. You also brought up South America. The Brazilians have largely caught up with their soybean planting, which was initially 2.5 weeks behind. And I believe Phil Plourd wrote this week's Market Moment email, which focused on that South American planting pace. I believe, Phil, we even addressed the La Nina chances as we enter 2025 of having a slightly elevated chance of La Nina. Was it around 60%?
Yeah, kind of coming into play in the spring, right? It's sort of prime time for the U.S. and season, prime time for U.S. planting and finishing season in South America.
Yeah, and so that's how will that time out and how severe will that La Nina be? We'll see. We do know from the most recent very strong La Nina of maybe the last 2 to 3 years prior, that we saw Argentine production take a pretty big drop, right, when it came to soybeans, their ability to crush beans and export meal. So that was a huge global supply constraint, right, was their La Nina-driven drought. Also, southern Brazil gets heavily affected as well. So
if it starts in April, Jim, then, right, I mean, the timing of it's really intriguing. Is that 25 thing or 26 thing?
Exactly right. And so does that potentially more affect the safrinha crop, that second corn crop in Brazil, or if it comes late enough, does it really impact the South Americans at all? But I think then back to Jake's point, good opportunity to take some offense now while we have pricing where it is at this moment on Halloween, and then maybe start to play defense around those positions, depending on what type of volatility we get then through the rest of the calendar year and into 2025. Jake, anything else on feed?
I don't think so. I think there's, like you said, some opportunity there, but we've been working on taking advantage of it here for a while. So a lot of folks, I think, are set up pretty well to start with.
Okay, excellent. Well, gentlemen, Great work today. A very spooky Halloween grain feed episode. Thank you very much. Jake, you really Phil did his best here, rocking his costume. I think you tried to hedge him out. What you've done down there in Wichita is it's something else. It's something else. I think some viewers are wondering if this is even a prop. This is maybe just your house.
They're third-generation heirlooms, family heirlooms.
Yeah, I bet they are, man.
And they've heard all the bad things you have to say about them.
As the saying goes, what happens in Wichita stays in Wichita.
Let's hope that's the case for everyone's Halloween this year. Let's hope that's the case. A big thanks to you both, and Phil especially. Thank you very much for joining the show and all the work you do running the Insight Squad here at EverAg. Phil, thanks for being here, sir.
My pleasure.
We'd also like to thank Corey and the EverAg Insights crew for their support. Thank you to Paige and Lexi for their production magic. Thank you to the viewers for watching the grain feed. Contact information is on the screen. We greatly appreciate your feedback. That's all for today. We'll see you next time on the Grain Feed.